The afferent arteriole brings in blood, and while it passes through, it goes through the glomerulus, which is a network of capillaries which functions as its sieve, and this is basically where filtration of the blood occurs. Everything except for most proteins like albumin and red blood cells are filtered. The actual things that are filtered are water, glucose, bicarbonate, potassium, sodium, chlorine, creatine, and urea. These are filtered through, at first, the porous endothelial cells, and then the semi-permeable basement membrane, which basically just helps make sure that only the small things can pass through, since some proteins can still pass through the endothelial cells. And finally, it goes through the tubular cells, which is where the cells make up the connection between this vessel and the actual inside of the Bowman's capsule. The connection is made possible by podocytes, and they're also called epithelial cells, which are long cells that wrap around the vessel. When these are all together, they're collectively known as glomerular filtrate. The proximal convoluted tube is a tubule that's lined with simple cuboidal epithelium along with microvilli, and the microvilli help increase the surface area, and they also help reabsorb everything good from the filtrate back into the blood. So the substances that are reabsorbed are 65% sodium chloride, and they're usually right by each other, so they could be together. So sodium chloride, potassium, and 65% water, which is done by osmosis, 100% glucose and amino acids, and those are reabsorbed because they can help with respiration and making proteins, and it would be a waste to get rid of them. And 90% bicarbonate is reabsorbed so that it can help maintain the pH of the blood, and 50% urea is reabsorbed. Other ions that are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tube are calcium and magnesium in some amounts. The reabsorption of these substances are actively pumped back into the blood by using ATP, which means there's mitochondria located in the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. The ATP makes it so that there is more solute out in the blood than in the filtrate. So basically, it just helps pump out sodium, so it helps regulate the isotonic solution to make it balanced or isotonic. The things that are secreted are ammonia and some drugs, or organic acids, and they're secreted back into the filtrate outside. And uric acid and hydrogen ions are secreted back into the proximal convoluted tube or the filtrate in it. Also, lactate and vitamins are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Next, in the loop of Henle is where the most concentration of urine occurs. It's basically highly concentrated filtrate. At first, it goes through the descending loop, which is where it dips down into the medulla to first make the concentration salty, since the medulla is very salty. And in that descending loop, around 25% of water is reabsorbed passively. This is because the descending loop of Henle is very permeable to water, while it has low permeability to things like the ions like Na and urea. In the descending limb, there is a hypotonic solution. When it reaches the bottom of the loop, it is the most concentrated, since by that time most of the water has left, and it only has a thin part. unlike what we're going to go over next, which is the ascending limb. A note for the descending limb. So the filtrate, or this now filtrate, has a low tonicity whenever it's being compared to the interstitium, and the interstitium is just the outside fluids, like outside of the Henle, and the tonicity is the ability of the solution to make the water come in or out of the cell by osmosis. It just basically is the osmotic pressure measurements. And in the descending limb, it's hypotonic. Since there are barely any amounts of water in the ascending limb, no water can escape the filtrate. At first, at the thin part of the ascending loop, around 25% of NaCl is passively reabsorbed, and then as it goes higher to the thick part of the ascending limb, more sodium or NaCl is absorbed, and now it's done actively, which means ATP is now involved. At the end, all that there is left in this filtrate is dilute, which means it's basically just weaker and thinner, and just like everything's left. In the ascending limb, the tonicity of the filtrate is low, and the tonicity of the interstitium is also low because of the thick limb of the ascending, and it blocks the osmotic pressure. This means that there is a hypertonic solution. The thin parts of the loop of Henle are lined with squamous epithelium. In the distal convoluted tubule, which is next, it is made of mostly simple cuboidal cells, and basically in the distal, it's where the fine-tuning and the final touches or adjustments are made to this filtrate. About 5% of NaCl is reabsorbed, along with bicarbonate, water, calcium, and the things that are secreted are hydrogen and potassium. Adding back to the bicarbonate, almost all of the bicarbonate is reabsorbed for this part. Since the distal convoluted tube is normally impermeable to water, only small amounts of H2O are reabsorbed, hence why it's only 5%. Also, magnesium and phosphate are reabsorbed, and ammonia is also secreted. The collecting duct is basically the last part, and it is made out of principal and intercalated cells. And it's, like I said before, it's basically where the final adjustments and everything for this filtrate happens before it leaves the body as urine. NaCl and urea are reabsorbed, and also, just a note for urea can sometimes re-enter the tubule at the loop of Henle, which is just basically helping the urea being recycled. The 5% of NaCl is reabsorbed, and water is also reabsorbed. The water is reabsorbed using water channels or aquaporins, and they're inserted into the epithelium, which then allows the water to be transported and reabsorbed back into the blood. The collecting duct basically just balances the electrolytes and the fluids or the substances. The ADH is produced in the hypothalamus and is released by the posterior pituitary gland. It is released whenever there's a decrease of blood pressure, so it increases blood pressure. It conserves the water directly through the reabsorption of water in the distant convoluted tubule, basically meaning that it regulates the rate of water reabsorption. Water is reabsorbed 8% to be specific if ADH is present in the DCT or distant convoluted tubule. The role of aldosterone is that it conserves the water indirectly, so this would mean the reabsorption of sodium, and it goes through the NAK channels, which means that basically meaning that the potassium is excreted while the sodium is retained. The structure where aldosterone plays its role is the distal convoluted tube. Also, unlike ADH, which is synthesized in the hypothalamus, the aldosterone is a steroid hormone that is produced in the adrenal cortex. The parathyroid hormone promotes calcium reabsorption whenever the calcium levels are low, and they block the reabsorption of phosphate. So it blocks the reabsorption of phosphate in the proximal tubule, and then it promotes the calcium reabsorption in the ascending loop, the distal tubule, and the collecting tubule. And the parathyroid hormone is secreted from the 4 parathyroid glands, which are small glands that are behind the thyroid gland. The atrial natriuretic peptide, or AMP for short, is a hormone that helps decrease the blood pressure because it helps with the secretion of sodium, and that means it reduces the ECF volume because of that, which basically means it just helps excrete more salt. And AMP is made by the place where the AMP works the most is the medullary collecting tubule. And the medullary collecting tubule is located where the collecting duct is. So alcohol inhibits ADH, and remember that ADH is the one that conserves water directly and it regulates water absorption. By inhibiting ADH, it means that there is no more moving aquaporin, which means that there are no water channels for the water to go through to be reabsorbed back into the blood, leading to very little water reabsorption, and that leads to dehydration and lots of urination. This means that usually there isn't enough water in the urine, so that makes it difficult, and that makes urination more than usual.